Welcome to EPG Pathshala. The module today is War on Women. It is module 8 and I'll be talking about women in combat. Here in the introduction, I would like to say that there is a lot of gender-based violence in war and conflict. While discussing how war and conflict affect women, one must realize that it is not only the question of women in conflict. Women's participation in war and conflict is varied. With the increase in conflict across the globe, there is a concomitant increase in sexual and other forms of violence against women. There is a quote here: "Women are victims of unbelievably horrific atrocities and injustices in conflict situations. This is indisputable. As refugees, internally displaced persons, combatants, heads of household and community leaders, as activists and peace builders, women and men experience conflict differently. Women rarely have the same resources, political rights, authority or control over their environment and need that men do. In addition, their caretaking responsibilities limit their mobility and ability to protect themselves." So we see how the roles of women change in combat. Women who provide care and support services to the combatants, women who work in weapon industry, women who are willing or forced to provide sexual services during war. There are examples like the comfort woman for Japanese during World War II, and we have prostitution of women and children in Cambodia for the American soldiers during Vietnam War. Women who worked as spies or who joins the resistance movement in occupied territories are all women who participate in wars in different roles. These women, along with the women who are not involved in war-related activities, are impacted by war in large numbers and in numerous ways. They suffer from direct and indirect effect of fighting and face various kinds of violence. Civilian women living in the combat zone have to face abuse like forced slavery, sexual violence, kidnapping, trafficking, disease transmission, physical and mental abuse. There are some of the common types of violence women face during and after conflict. Sexual violence like rape, impregnation, and sexual mutilation are also used as weapons of war on women during the conflict. As discussed earlier, as we see an increase of conflict across the globe, we also see an epic increase in sexual and other kinds of violence against women. In the escalating conflict in recent times, women experience violence at the hands of the government actors, non-state militaries, which includes rebel forces and dissidents, community members, and even tragically the peacekeeping forces that are sent to protect them and restore order. It is estimated that 4 out of 5 casualties in all modern wars are civilians, and more than half of the civilians are women. In the fight to control between patriarchal notion of nationhood, group identity or ideology, women's bodies become the battlefield as they face violence both from the enemy and at home. So even women and girls who take shelters in the refugee camps or camps for the internally displaced people face sexual and other forms of violence frequently. Example, between 1991 and 2001, 50,000 to 64,000 women in Sierra Leone displacement camp were sexually assaulted by combatants. So we see how women, even in the refugee camps, they are being sexually assaulted either by the perpetrators or by the peacekeepers. Gender-based violence is tactically used in conflicts to harm, humiliate, and shame the enemy. During war and conflicts, sexual violence like rape, sexual mutilation, impregnation, and forced abortion, forced nudity, and stripped searches, etc., are used as instruments of power to destabilize the civilian population and to violate the honor of the opposing force. While women and girls face maximum amount of sexual violence, civilian men and boys are also subjected to these brutalities. Violence to establish masculine supremacy in war or conflict situation and are now codified and prosecuted as most serious of crimes in international law. Gender-based violence is a term that is used to describe any harmful act that is perpetrated against a person's will and that is based on socially ascribed differences between males and females. While men and boys are victims, survivors of some type of gender-based violence around the world, gender-based violence has greater impact on women and girls. And that has been very common in the conflict situation. There is a common saying that to the victor goes the spoils. For centuries, women have been perceived as a part of the spoils of war. That is why rape has not been recognized as a serious offense. War rape that has been regarded as regrettably but inescapable side effect of war. In the past, war rape was considered a reward for soldiers. Warfare itself is often represented as rape, where cities that are looted and ransacked are seen as victims. War rape reinforced the stereotypes about women as victims and violent men as powerful. So because of this social structure, that men are more powerful, even during war, they victimize the woman to show their supremacy, the male supremacy in war. The absence of data on sexual and gender-based violence hampers the work of the governmental and non-governmental agencies working in this field. Sexual violence is usually unreported. The impact of armed conflict and scale of human rights abuses include the rape during wartime, and sometimes it is manipulated by political ends by the various parties of the conflict. Some examples of gender-based violence in recent conflicts. In the Democratic Republic of Congo, 10,000s of women and girls have been raped. UN officials is just one part of Eastern Congo, North Kivu estimated that there were 25,000 cases of sexual violence against women and children each year. Hundreds of women line up to receive extensive surgery due to mutilation for the rapes. In mid-2006, Darfur, 200 women experienced sexual violence inside 5-week period. Earlier in 2005, 500 rape survivors had to receive medical care. Internally displaced women and girls from Sierra Leone had suffered an extraordinary level of rape, sexual violence and gross human rights during the country's civil war. During the Bosnian War between the Serbs and Bosnians, reports have shown that 3 kinds of rapes took place. Rapes that occurred when the Serbs first occupied a village, rapes committed by prison guards in the detention camps, and rape camps of houses temporarily commanded by Serbs specially for that purpose. Estimated 12,000 to 50,000 women were raped during the Bosnian War. Thousands of women were tied in shackles, forced to work, raped, impregnated and killed during the Khmer-Rouge regime conflicts. Closer home, the 1971 Bangladesh War showed that there were about 2 lakh women who were raped by the Pakistan army. Rape camps, mass rape followed by mass murder and sexual mutilation like cutting of breasts, etc., were imposed on the Bangladeshi woman. During the last civil conflict in Liberia, local media reported that there were about 50% of the 658 rape survivors between aged 5 and 12 years. In 90% of the cases involving children, the attackers were somehow known to the victims. And probably that is the reason why most of the rape cases are not reported, either for the shame of the society or to save their grace. There are long-term effects on gender-based violence. We are going to talk about it now. Sexual and other forms of violence are very common during war, and it has a long-lasting psychological and economic impact on women and children and men too. The impact of gender-based violence and sexual violence can be devastating for the survivors, their families, communities and nation. The effects of gender-based violence like physical injuries, psychological trauma and social stigma lasts long after the end of the conflict in Bangladesh. Hundreds of children were born out of rapes and they were either abandoned or murdered. The women themselves face stigma and discrimination till today for no fault of their own. Many committed suicide or ran away to India and other countries. The effect of gender-based violence impacts the relationship. It raises anger and violence even within the communities. Brown Miller has said that war provides men with the perfect psychological backdrop to give vent to their contempt for women. The very maleness of the military, the brute power of weaponry exclusive to their hands, the spiritual bonding of men at arms, the manly discipline of orders given and orders obeyed, the simple logic of the hierarchical command confirms for men that they are long suspect that women are peripheral, irrelevant to what the world that counts passive spectators to the action in the center ring. Men who rape in war are ordinary Joes made unordinarily by the entry into the most exclusive male-only club in the world. Victory in arms bring groups power undreamed of in civilian life, power for men alone. So we see how gender-based violence is so common during war and conflict. And we see that the victims are mostly women. It's not that the men are excluded from the sexual abuse, but the percentage of women is much more. So survivors of the gender-based violence face long-term health issues in the post-conflict areas. We see that sexually transmitted diseases like HIV, AIDS, post-traumatic stress disorder are long-term impacts of such abuse. Gender-based violence during war leads to forced pregnancies. And what happens to these children? Women are forced to give birth to the children without proper medical aid, and they are often forced to abandon them and deny the children that their love, their care, which is actually the result of rape. These actions subject the woman to immense physical and mental stress. Because women by nature are caregivers, and when they have to abandon their children because they fear the social stigma, a lot of stress is there on their mental health. Now, are there sufficient laws and actions that are taken against these people who are involved in this gender-based violence during conflict? That is one question that is to be examined. Over the years, the war has seen a lot of sexual violence, and it is unimaginable, especially during war. So, over the years, the world has witnessed a number of acts of violence against women, and it is unimaginable. In countries like Croatia, Bangladesh, Rwanda, the list is endless, has brought the issue of sexual violence during war to international attention. However, international humanitarian law instruments have failed effectively to address the issues of sexual assault, particularly war rape. So, we see how even if there has been a issue, it has been a major issue during war, yet it has not been addressed or has not been given proper attention. The Labor Code of April 24th, 1863, also known as the Instructions for the Government of Armies of the United States in the Field, was the first expressly codified law that dealt with issues of land warfare and has had an important influence on the modern laws of war. The code dealt with rape in two ways. Article 37 provides general protection to women in conflict, while Article 44 expressly proscribed rape. The current application law regarding war is contained within the Nuremberg Charter, the 1949 Geneva Conventions, and the 1977 additional protocols. These laws, however, contain a number of inconsistencies and contradiction with respect to defining sexual violence as a serious offense. There is another quote which talks about conflict-related sexual violence, and that was consulted and agreed by UN action over 2011 and was set out in the report of the Secretary General to the Security Council on the conflict-related sexual violence of 13 January 2012. And it says that CRSV refers to incidents or patterns of sexual violence, that is rape, sexual slavery, forced prostitution, forced pregnancy, enforced sterilization, or any other form of sexual violence of comparable gravity against women, men, or children. Such incidents or patterns occur in conflict or post-conflict settings or other situations of concern, example, political strife. They also have a direct or indirect nexus with the conflict or political strife itself, that is, a temporal, geographical, and or causal link. In addition to the international character of the suspected crimes, which can, depending on the circumstances, constitute war crimes, crime against humanity, acts of genocide, or other gross violation of human rights. The link with conflict may be evident in the profile and motivation of the perpetrators, profile of the victims, the climate of impunity, state collapse, cross-border dimensions, and or the fact that they violate the terms of ceasefire agreement. The International Court of Law recognizes rape in particular and gender-based violence in general as a serious war crime. And there are some pointers that a growing number of post-conflict countries are taking steps to incorporate protection for survivors and tougher sentence for perpetrators into legal form process. Within and through the UN, attempts are being made to identify processes that can address the issues of accountability and impunity. The international and a few national courts have recognized violence of women's human rights during conflicts as violence of human rights principle and humanitarian laws. So we see that the process of recognizing violation of women's human rights as a crime against humanity has been slow, but of course it is very, very recent also in its process. It is recognized that although the establishment of judicial processes, programs to address the needs of the survivors of gender-based violence to be able to overcome its impact requires to be put in place. There is no stern laws to punish the perpetrators, and even if they talk about protection of women, in the field we see that there is hardly anything done to protect women. So along with the strict punishment to prevent this gender-based violence, constructive programs are needed to ensure protection of women's rights during conflict. Convention of Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, which is popularly known as CEDAW 1979, and the Sexual and Gender Violence Framework of United Nations Office for Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs are examples of existing laws and frameworks that can be used to address the gender-based violence in conflict. Although CEDAW does not address violence against women of gender-based violence in conflict directly, its general provisions can be used to protect women from gender-based violence. We see that CEDAW does not have any strict rule or does not have any direct principles to protect women in violent situation during conflict, yet they have certain principles which can protect women from gender-based violence. The UN Declaration on the Elimination of Violence Against Women, International Criminal Tribunal for Yugoslavia, International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, Special Court for Sierra Leone, Extraordinary Court Chambers in Cambodia are examples of international mechanism of law and justice that have addressed gender-based violence while addressing war crimes. Now, there is a feminist analysis of gender-based violence. The second wave of feminist movement, or the second wave of feminist thinkers, were first to recognize the gender-based violence is not an outcome of individual anger, but of inequality arising out of the patriarchy and gender division. It was in this period that the discourse around domestic violence was going through a paradigm shift. From being a private individual issue, it was being brought into public as a social problem. Feminists recognize violence as an instrument of establishing supremacy of power, and sexual and gender-based violence as establishing power of masculine over feminine. This is how the second wave feminist thinker thought. So, in the study of masculinity and sexuality, the gender-based violence is primarily seen as men against women and children. Gender-based violence is usually carried out by men, but it can also be a violence towards men and other boys. So, we see that this gender-based violence is not confined to women alone. So, men and boys are raped and humiliated by men as well as women. One must remember that the intense violence that women suffer during conflict is not just a result of war. It is directly related to the violence that existed in women's life even during peace. Women all over the world face violence in different forms only because they are women and because they do not have the same legal and political rights as men. Feminists understand war, conflict itself is essentially patriarchal and gender-based violence as a demonstration of male domination during war. Okay, it is a domination of male over female. The ideology of war, which is to establish domination of one nation or one group over the other, is the same gender-based violence where the powerful males try to dominate the females or the lesser groups. Feminists from the peace movement identify gender-based violence or violence against women as an integral part of militarization or war. So, as there has been and there will be war, there will be violence used against women. For that, it is very important that we do something. The violence against war is taken as an expression of patriarchy. So, to end this gender-based violence in conflict, we are first to dismantle patriarchy and the notion of nationhood, territory, and power. So, we see that to end the gender-based violence, we first have to dismantle patriarchy, the concept of or the notions of nationhood, territory and power. It is all because of the patriarchal mindset of the people that the domination of male over woman is not only seen in general life, but during the conflict that is taken as a weapon for the enemy camp to humiliate, to kind of weaken the enemy nation. Rape has always been considered a very powerful weapon, and where mostly women are being victimized. And it's not only women, we see children, minor children and also men being brutalized, being sexually abused and traumatized both physically and mentally.